All right. Hi, everybody. Today we are going to be going over Chapter 4. I can finally record this from a table as opposed to a countertop because I'm all moved in, except I don't have any living room furniture yet. So all that to say, I hope you've already read Chapter 4. If not, you can use this as supplemental until you do, and this will help you go over the important terms for that chapter. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen with y'all. All right, well, let's go back to the beginning. Perfect. All right, we're here. Thanks for bearing with that. All right, Chapter 4 is verbal communication. For this chapter, we're going to describe the power of language, the system of symbols we use to think about and communicate our experiences and feelings, language. We're going to identify the ways that language works to help people communicate. We're going to go over the 5 functional communication competencies, which are going to be very important for this chapter. Some more chapter outcomes are going to be describing the way that communicators create meaning with language, labeling problematic uses of language and their remedies, and describing how language reflects, builds on, determines the situational, relational, and cultural and mediated context. That one was a mouthful. All right, so language. For our class, the definition of language is going to be the system of symbols, words, or codes that we use to think about and communicate experiences and feelings. So the things that we use to interact with each other to communicate how we feel and communicate experiences. The nature of language. So language is symbolic. Words are little symbols, AKA codes is the word the book wants you to use. Words are symbols or signs that represent a person, idea, or thing. So the word is not the thing, but we've assigned meaning to the thing, right? Like water bottle, not actually a water bottle, but water bottle is the label or the thing that we glue to this so we can talk about it in a way that's meaningful to everybody and everybody understands what it is that we're talking about, like the thing. Thought informs language and vice versa. So the way we think about things informs the way we talk about things and vice versa. Cognitive language, so specific symbols used to describe people, things, ideas, situations, so on and so forth. That's cognitive language. So language ruled by grammar. Obviously, our language has to have grammar. Our language has to have a set of rules which we all adhere to, so that way we can communicate clearly and effectively, right? So we have phonological rules like pronunciation, the way we pronounce words, and those vary by region, right? We don't pronounce things the same way here that we do in London, right? And then syntactic rules, so like syntax. Word placement in a sentence. A sentence structure matters, right? The way that we place like verbs in sentences in ways that allow them to make sense in our language is really, really important because it allows us to have and create a mutual understanding in a way that makes sense and in a way that we can learn and we can teach effectively. The functions of language. So communication acquisition involves learning words of the language, right? And then using the words appropriately and effectively in the various contexts, right? So in order for us to be able to effectively communicate, we need to understand our context and we need to use words appropriately in said contexts, right? So like if you're using slang from a different group, then no one's going to have any idea what you're talking about. Like, for example, like, this is really embarrassing, but when I was in undergrad, we had this really, really silly word that we made up for when we were really, really tired. Like, do you know when you get to the point where you're really tired and everything's just hilarious? People call that nerping. And so if I said that to y'all and you had no idea what I was talking about, that would be not be using my words appropriately or effectively in my various contexts. Functional communication competencies, yes. So using language as means of control to influence oneself, others, and the environment. So using language to share information involves 4 main things, and those are questioning, describing, reinforcing, and withholding, right? So questioning, you're going to go ahead and question ideas and things to better understand someone's context or the things that someone has to say. You're going to describe your experiences, your feelings, so people can get a fully rounded idea of the thing that you're communicating. You're going to reinforce those ideas by highlighting details or saying it in multiple ways, or then you're going to withhold information that isn't absolutely necessary to the conversation that you're having, right? Like staying on topic. Using language to express feelings appropriately and effectively. So using language to express creativity, like imagining, the ability to think, play, and be creative in communication, right? Using different words so we're not using the word always or besides all the time. Being able to vary your word choice so you don't sound monotonous in your language. And then language is a ritual. I can't speak today. I am so sorry. Ritualizing. That's the word. Okay, learning the rules for managing conversations and relationships. So we all have rituals in our conversations. A ritual that we have in the NFL is people singing the national anthem before every game. That's a ritual. And we have rituals in the way we communicate, like saying hello when you answer the phone, or if you have a different thing that you say with your friends, like that is a ritual. And you have to learn the rules for managing those conversations and the different relationships, because you have different rituals in your different relationships. Like if you have a friend that you answer the phone and say what to instead of hello, like as a joke. Those are the rituals that you learn in your relationships. Language and meaning, semantics. So semantics is a relationship among symbols, objects, people, and concepts. Meaning of words the meaning of words based on their definitions or placement in a sentence. So semantics. And then pragmatics is the ability to use a culture's systems and symbols appropriately. So making sure you're using other cultural symbols and systems appropriately, making sure you're understanding their contexts and their rituals when engaging in that language or that culture. Words have multiple meanings. So denotation or denotative is the dictionary definition of a word, right? Like what it means, like literally what it means. And then connotation or connotative is the emotional or attitudinal response to the word, right? So like my favorite example of this is the word ignorant, right? So the definition of the word ignorant is to not know. Like you are ignorant to football, right? You just don't know anything about football. But there's just so much connotation with the word ignorant, you know? Like if someone calls you ignorant, you're gonna be upset, or at least I would be, right? So there's just a lot of connotation that are just soaked in our words and in our language. Like there are words that are taboo, and there are words that have some implied meaning, like K when you're texting. If someone texts you K, it literally just means okay, but there's a connotative meaning to it, right? Like oh my gosh, they're upset with me. Or as opposed to maybe they were just driving and they meant to send okay, right? But don't text and drive, don't do that. So abstraction. So there are high and low levels of abstraction, right? You can be more abstract in your language, or you could be less abstract in your language. There's going to be an abstraction ladder on the next page that illustrates specific versus general levels of abstraction. And then high abstraction is going to be evasion, like avoiding giving details when you're not detailed in your language. And equivocation is just using unclear words that we just might not necessarily know what exactly you're meaning by, so it's very abstract, so we don't totally have an understanding of what it is that you're trying to communicate. So the abstraction ladder. So something that is a very abstract thing to say is you're useless, right? Like what are you useless? You didn't complete a task, maybe. And then less abstract would you never help out around the house. Like okay, what specifically around the house? Still pretty vague. You keep forgetting to do your chores. Okay, less abstract, probably medium on the abstraction ladder. Like what chores specifically? You could be a lot more specific. The trash wasn't emptied last night and it's your job to do that. All right, now we're getting in more clear, less abstract territory. And the most concrete example is I noticed you didn't take out the trash in the kitchen, the bathroom, or the bedroom. You agreed taking out the trash every Monday and Thursday evening would be your job. So that is the less abstract way of getting at what exactly it is you're trying to communicate. And oftentimes we're very abstract without even realizing it, right? Like if sometimes we're frustrated and we try to communicate that frustration through "you're useless," the person that we're telling you're useless to may not have a fully fledged understanding of what it is that we're trying to communicate because we're being so abstract. So the abstraction matter. Problematic uses of language. So there is hateful and hurtful language. So hate speech would be for our class defined as language that offends, threatens, or insults a person or a group based upon race, religion, gender, or culture, or any other identifiable characteristic. Words are hard today, y'all. And then hurtful language, which is inappropriate, damaging, mean, sarcastic, or offensive statements that affect others negatively. These are things that we need to identify in our own language and absolutely try to remove ourselves from because we don't want to be engaging in hateful or hurtful language at all. All right, labeling. Labeling for our class is going to be the labels we choose for our beliefs and how to communicate them to others and how others respond, right? So labels may lead us to ignore individual differences, thus limits or constricts our communication, right? If we label someone and put them in a box and we never really give them a chance to get out of that box. And then labeling could reinforce stereotypes because you're just reinforcing the things that you know about that person through a label. Biased language. So biased language openly excludes or implies something about a certain group, right? It can be negative or positive, like resume language, like thinking about, like, let's say, like you, like cleaned bathrooms. Head of sanitation, right? When we think of resume language or biased language when describing things, it's typically something that we try to stay away from, so we can be as upfront about our language as possible or as objective as opposed to biased as possible, but sometimes that's really difficult for us to do as human beings. And then politically correct language. For our class, the definition of politically correct language is going to be language that uses neutral terms in place of biased language and may avoid real issues in favor of politeness. So doing our best not to offend people with our language and doing our best to communicate effectively in a way that is appropriate and polite to everybody. Political correctness gets a really bad rep these days, but it's really just a good way of being polite and considerate of other people's feelings, in my opinion. Okay, profanity. Profanity is going to be taboo, rude, vulgar, or disrespectful words or expressions. Some may see offensive words as reasonably hostile based on situational context. I don't know, but it also depends on your social circle, right? So I think profanity counts if, like you say, vulgar language in front of somebody who would be offended by it, right? But in front of your friends, like profanities probably don't have the same effect as they might around your parents or your family or, I don't know, your teacher, right? And then civility, social norms for appropriate behavior. So civility is just being civil to better understand or totally understand social appropriateness for the behavior you should be exhibiting, right? Communication accommodation theory. So communication accommodation theory argues that competent communicators adjust their language and nonverbal behaviors, which we'll talk about more next chapter, to a person, group, or context. So we accommodate, right? Like, appropriately. So we don't try to over accommodate because that can be seen as offensive if we're over accommodating for somebody. Like I think I gave the example in a previous class of like yelling at an elderly person because we assume that they can't hear us, but maybe they do have a hard time hearing and you need to raise your voice a little bit, without being like perceived as offensive or making assumptions about a person, but obviously understanding their needs because you know them and then meeting them where they need to be met, right? So communication accommodation, accommodating our own communication to cater to others, maybe in ways that they might need us to meet them halfway at, right? Language is bound by context, 1 of 9. Whew, okay. So language reflects context, right? We have a variety of speech repertoires. We have a variety of contexts through which we engage in. We engage in school, we engage in work, we engage at home, we engage with our friends. There are a million different contexts, and we probably use different language when engaging with all of them. Language builds on context. So we adjust our language to a situation, right? So we understand the appropriateness of a context through the way that people communicate with us and we're able to communicate with them. Language determines context, right? We get to choose formal or informal language. And sometimes we break down barriers. Like, I don't know if you've had some teachers or professors that you've needed to be really formal with, right? But then they respond really, really informally to you. So then you kind of create this relationship that's a little less formal. So language can help determine the context of a formal or informal relationship, or any kind of relationship, really. Situational context. So sometimes in situational context, we use high language, formal, polite, mainstream language, low language, informal, casual language, often involving slang, and sex and gender are a part of situational context. We communicate differently depending on who it is that we're communicating with, because we want to be aware of everybody and everybody's preferences and everybody's like preferences on how we communicate with them and how they communicate with us, right? Relational contexts. So using language and levels of abstraction to create / reflect relationships. Like, we're probably more okay using more abstract language with people that we know better, because we can assume those people would know what we mean, right? So there's relational context. There's speaking code, so computer code. The directions given to a computer make it do what you want to do, right? So when we're speaking with other people, when we use the codes that they understand, we can give better directions, right? So if you give effective coding to a person, we can effectively communicate our feelings, our experiences, or even directions for any particular context that we would need to communicate directions. Cultural context. So culture, words, and thought, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, linguistics, relativity theory. The words a culture uses or doesn't use influences the way individuals think, right? So the way that we talk about things influences the way we think about things. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but the words we choose determine the way that we think about things, which is why media is so powerful. Because the media we engage in and the words that they choose to use really not manipulates, but really, I guess manipulates the way we think about issues, social issues, like any kind of issues that we can hear about in any context where we have the capacity to be influenced. Group members, slang. So cultural context matters in the context of groups because people use slang, like I talked about a little bit earlier with nerping. Super lame, I'm sorry about it. But typically slang includes informal, non-standard words. They don't even have to be words. They can be things that your group created. Jargon, using technical language, and gossip, engaging in rumors to talk about a person or private affairs. This typically happens in group memberships as opposed to, I don't know, individuals, because you can't talk to yourself. I mean, you can't talk to yourself. I'm talking to myself right now. But typically we gossip to other people about ideas or private affairs or other people. Cultural context, gender and language. So gender and language, the relationship of language and gender is both complex and tenuous when considering transgender individuals. Typically, males use interruptions and females use intensifiers, qualifiers, hedges, disclaimers, and tag questions. Both use resistance messages differently, so like deflection or avoidance when talking about these complex issues, right? So cultural context and understanding a person really matters when you are trying to interact with them and trying to figure out what their preferences are, right? And just catering to the person because they're a person and you want to care for them well. Cultural context, geography. Local geography affects language and an understanding of the world, right? So like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of words that don't mean the same thing in two different places, but we have words that mean things here that don't mean the same things in like London or like Ireland. I can't think of one now, but I'm sure you can, and I hope that you do. So a word that means something here that means something else somewhere else. Oh, like soda and pop, right? Those mean two different things. Like pop here, when I think of like an explosion, like pop, or like my back popping. Wow, I am getting old. Mediated context. Communication via technology requires strong and clear language. The speeds and ease of using technology may change language, and it actually often has, like LOL, LMFAO, like all the different things that we use to communicate. Really changed the way that we talk about things. And we've created really a sub-language, like another language within the context of mediated communication that allows us to speak in ways that we've never really been able to before. Like even emojis, some scholars argue emojis are actually like a sub-language. Like they aid to communication in ways that like words can't. You know, they convey emotions, they express things. And English has become the language of the internet and the mass media for, I don't know, a plethora of reasons, but we'll talk about that in history, I guess. So all that to say, that is our chapter on verbal communication. This isn't my favorite chapter, but we're doing it anyway. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you watch the next lecture on nonverbal communication. That is one of my favorite chapters. So I will see you all soon. I hope you're having a great Sunday, and I hope you're watching these videos. Bye, y'all.